You're listening to Blockchain 2025. The future is right now. Every week, we explore implications of the technology underpinning cryptocurrencies, blockchain.
Each episode is a standalone examination of one industry broken into 3 segments: a basic overview, blockchain's disruptive impact, and relevant crypto projects.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
Welcome to Blockchain 2025. In today's episode, we are going to cover voting. We touched on it in our government episode a few weeks back, but specifically elections and being able to vote on things using the blockchain. Could it change things up? I mean, for the older people listening to the show, there is one election that stands out, and that's the 2000 US presidential election. Isa, go ahead and play the clip there.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column. 25 very big electoral votes in the home state of the governor's brother, Jeb Bush, are hanging in the balance. This no longer is a victory for Vice President Gore.
Wow.
All right, so Kelso, welcome to the show.
Great to be back, man.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you, man. And as the co-host with the co-most, can you fill in listeners what happened there?
Yeah, I was of voting age at the time, and this is back in 2000. So the Clinton-Gore administration had basically wrapped up, and Gore, it was more or less a coronation. He was supposed to win, and it didn't quite work out that way. So we get to the state of Florida in the presidential race of 2000. As you heard, initially Judy Woodruff of CNN's got it, and they put it in the Gore column, as CNN is wont to do. And then a few minutes later, Bernard Shaw's got to break back in and say, nah, it looks like it's too close to call. And as we'll play a little bit later, it just goes on from there. It's fantastic listening, but it gives you some idea about sort of setting the table today for our conversation about blockchain and elections. Elections hold on to this old tech, and we're in a definitely different world now.
For sure. And Florida was the deciding state, right? And what caused the recount in the first place? Did Al Gore call for a recount of the election in Florida?
Yeah, it turns out actually both campaigns, would go back and forth with recount charges in various different counties of Florida. On the show notes page, we'll have a real cool picture of the actual butterfly ballots that they were using down there. And again, from county to county, it sort of adjusted and changed. It was that close. But in one particular county that I remember, it was filled with geriatric folks of the Jewish persuasion who were definitely more, say, Gore than they were Bush in terms of polls. But they for sure were not for a then fringe candidate named Pat Buchanan, who was somewhat considered anti-Semitic at the time. Whether or not he is a whole different question. But the point being, all of a sudden, these counties in Florida with the large Jewish population were going for Buchanan. And so if you look at these butterfly ballots, you'll see that it's not because they're older or they can't see well or whatever. It's very confusing. If you punch just the wrong place, obviously, the entire point of it goes out the window. So at that point, the Gore campaign definitely calls for a recount, and all hell breaks loose.
For sure. So this was an election that there was a recount in 4 counties. Then there was a time limit because it took days to recount the votes here. So people were left in limbo. Who is going to be the president of the United States? Finally, with Bush having a 537 vote lead, it went to the Supreme Court, which ruled that the recounting is over. And that Supreme Court vote was 5-4. So you could argue that Bush won by 1 vote. And in this, what does this highlight? This highlights that really all over the world, there are problems with ballots counting the votes. There was a problem in one county, Palm Beach County, 20,000 people voted for both George Bush and Al Gore. And this happens all the time. more voters in a county than there are registered somehow vote for X candidate in an election fraud. This is a big deal.
It carries these ginormous consequences because we're not talking again about dog catcher or, some sort of lame Board of Education seat or something. We're talking about leader of the free world. And at the time, you can actually go back in political science lore. They love to sort of go through the elections. Even as far back as 1960, when a young Senator Kennedy took on then Vice President Richard Nixon. To this day, it's not radical, out there revisionist history, although it is revision. They say that the Kennedys basically stole the election or someone fraudulently stuffed ballots for him. So what we're getting at is not that Bush is good, Gore is bad, or Kennedy or Nixon or anything like that. It's more that transparency is needed for a lot of reasons, but for the most probably important reason is that these elections carry such huge consequences.
Right. And another thing to be cognizant of is that this is an archaic process. In the United States, the election day is on a Tuesday. Mm-hmm. Do you know why that is?
I remember you sort of explaining to me pre-show, but I've actually forgotten. Tell me again.
So basically the Sunday, we were an agricultural country, and Sunday was the Sabbath, was the holy day. And to get to the voting booth, it would take a day of travel. So the idea was rest on Sunday, travel on Monday, and vote on Tuesday, and then go back to farming. Obviously, things have changed since then, to put it lightly. And that's just one example. The other thing I'd like to talk about, Kelso, is the access to be able to vote. The time and money that it costs to run these physical polling stations is considerate, but an even bigger cost are all the people that cannot vote.
Yeah, and that's sort of, it rubs you raw a bunch of different ways. It is a barrier to entry that governments have used, time immemorial. More recently in the mid-20th century, they used poll taxes and all sorts of stuff to suppress African-American voting here in the States. But now it's a little less obvious, but just having recourse to an ID in some countries is a monumental procedure, getting birth certificates ready, all your proper documentation. And they're in no hurry to onboard more people who could possibly and quite literally take them from seats of power. So there are no inducements to actually change in this regard. And this is where I think blockchain could really, really shine. For sure, yeah. I mean, driving to the voting booth, taking half an hour off, taking off work, maybe taking care of kids, things like that. Not everyone can afford to do that. So, the idea of getting more people to vote in a democracy would be a positive thing. And also, let's be real, going to statistics, and I got this from none other than Vitalik Buterin in one of his many essays, and the chance that your vote will actually make a difference in a U.S. presidential election is 1 in 10 million. So coupled with the fact that it's not that likely that your vote will make a difference, logically, right? You got to make this as easy as possible to get as many people to vote. Yeah. And this last one with El Donald, the orange god of thunder, and Bill Clinton's wife, regardless of what you think about the outcome or the two parties involved, she won by something like 3 million votes popularly. And he, of course, won through the Electoral College. I think that's becoming problematic. A lot of people that I know that I sort of operate in circles, academic circles, with regard to political science, defend the Electoral College as a counter-majoritarian idea. But now it's getting to the point where, 3 million doesn't trouble you, right? Oh, well, those are just, California yahoos that are with Kelso, so who cares? What about 20 million? So 20 million more people next time vote for the other candidate that is not installed as president. You can kind of see what's coming. So I don't know if blockchain necessarily answers that question, but it would be nice to have it, blanketly out there transparently so people understand the Buterin concept that you've outlined here, that it is not one person, one vote, at least in the federal election. And having recourse to knowing, how these things are shaking out, it's going to disabuse, especially Americans who have to be re-educated every 4 years here on basic civics about how to elect their executive. It's going to rejigger how people look at these elections, and maybe that will force some reform.
For sure. And so in the disruption, I think if you take away one thing from this podcast, or two things. One is that when you compare solutions using blockchain, you can't look at perfection because there will be flaws in blockchain voting and it's still unproven, but you have to compare it to the best possible alternative. And what we currently have is just not that good. And number two, and maybe this should be number one, is the idea of turning your phone into a voting booth is very powerful. Verifying your identity. And I think that's the one phrase you should take away from this podcast.
Love this idea.
Turn your phone into a voting booth, not just for presidential elections, could change a culture where you could put out a referendum and citizens locally, nationally, PTA, whatever it may be, could vote on many things and get into a culture of voting.
And what's sort of nice about this particular episode and how you're framing it right now is that this is not, some grand science fiction future that we're looking towards. Well, we were promised jetpacks and all the rest of it, as I love to scream. It's more, this could happen right now. So if you go to emerging markets or third, fourth, fifth world countries, you'll find that they have access to smartphones or something approximating a smartphone already, right? So SMS technology, all that is more or less, ubiquitous. Getting those people on the rolls in those countries, I don't know if it's for better or for worse, to be honest with you. But if you're going to have this giant apparatus, you have to let people decide, especially if it's going to directly impact them. So it can happen right now within reason. This is not, way off in the distant future. For
sure. And let's move into some of the projects that are trying to cover it. First off, Agora. It's a Swiss company. They were trying to help out in Sierra Leone in their election. Basically, they had 280 people manually counting votes and writing the data to a permissioned blockchain. Okay, think about that. This is not the ideal example, right? This is not what I envisioned.
Right away.
I mean, manual entries into a blockchain, it might have been better just to count them. Obviously, they have a long way to go, but it was good for the Swiss to get down to Africa and get some real world experience and observe an election, I think. Or at least they had a fun trip. But that's probably the least impressive one. And I'm not trying to call out Agora.vote. I'm sure that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and they're also in Sierra Leone, which is probably not that advanced. And I'm sure they're moving towards more a true permissionless blockchain voting system. But Kelso, what are some other cool startups that you've seen?
There are quite a few that exist out there. I really like Democracy Earth, Follow My Vote, Democracy OS, Vote Watcher. A lot of these are some pretty interesting groups with regard to how they approach voting. They tend to focus on the macro concept. So how this shakes out with regard to, say, county voting or the issues of gerrymandering, I'm not exactly clear on. But in terms of, say, Democracy Earth, well, I'll just toss it back to you. Colombia, I think just last year or the year before, sort of sewed up with some agreements with FARC, the Western Hemisphere as being entirely without any military conflict. And groups like Democracy Earth are trying to kind of help, maintain that peace process in Colombia. But I'll let you, since you're there on the ground, kind of go through that a little bit.
Yeah. So what happened is, and this happens in all countries, are people that are abroad that need to vote. Sometimes it's impossible. Other times it's going to the embassy. It's even more work than voting where you live or, back in your home country. So Democracy Earth, working with technology and the peace process, do you agree to this peace deal? It was a leading question. It's like, do you agree to this peace deal and therefore want to create peace in Colombia? It was a very leading question. Nonetheless, they lost.
Have you stopped beating your wife?
It was like Brexit. Yeah, exactly. Nonetheless, they lost. It was not approved.
Sure.
The president, after being embarrassed, he's like, all right, we'll just pass it anyway. Having said that, I applaud Democracy Earth for allowing Colombians that are living abroad to have the chance to vote.
Just the idea that there's a new way to try and include more people. Again, I think that has to be the sort of guiding principle going forward with regard to state systems. You're considered legitimate. Again, I have lots of issues with even my own wording right now. You're considered legitimate as a state the more inclusive you are vis-a-vis either voting or, however you get to that point. And so the reverse is true. You will be seen as illegitimate. Trump has had a gargantuan, this is in a very evolved, quote unquote, very rich society. And Trump has had a hell of a time just trying to assert the fact that he's president. he's had to go off and talk about all sorts of stuff. But anyway, the point being, I'm glad that someone or some groups are out there attempting to kind of shine light on these issues and get more people involved. But anyway, you were going to talk about another group.
Yeah, very good point there. I also like Voatz, Voatz, Voatz.com. They're like, for any type of election, whether it's school, regional, local, corporate, right? Any type of election and voting. We have an app. It's ready to go. They're running a pilot now in West Virginia for some local government votes. So I think that's pretty cool that they're starting to do this and they're starting to test the platform out. I don't think we should immediately go to votes for the next national election. But this is kind of cool, right? Because Blockchain 2025, it's about the future. As you know, I'm a huge fan of prediction markets, identity, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
But it's barely, if at all, being used right now. I did put my first vote out on Augur. But having said that, it's like a niche within a niche.
Right.
Like most people within the Bitcoin space don't even know what prediction markets are. This is something that people are trying out right now because they see the benefit, and that's cool.
Yeah, West Virginia actually, used live demo, and it did go pretty well. Again, it was a very small universe in this case, but using the blockchain to try to suss out if there were any, fraudulent cases, these sorts of things, onboarding people very fast, streamlining counting. These are points of failure, as Talib would call them, sort of these fragile points at which trust breaks down. Nefarious actors can get in there and kind of change things. Just the mind boggles. There's been a recent spate of elections from Africa, Zimbabwe, to the latest election in Mexico, here in my part of the world, where these people can't get off the ground. They can't, because their very legitimacy is questioned, even though they went through this gigantic theater and this campaign, and all these people went out to do their civic duty and so on, and they still can't quite get it right. Maybe having something just literally in front of everybody that everybody can audit, everybody can look at, will help expedite that, at least making them legitimate. So if you're going to thrust X person on me or whatever and say, we voted, at the very least you can do is make sure that that person is legitimate, right?
For sure, man. And yeah, we didn't go too deep into the corruption in elections, Venezuela, Russia, right? But I think two things I like to add here is a provably fair election. And to be very clear, whether you could fake someone's fingerprints or hack phones, it's not proven that blockchain can provably fair.
Right.
I would venture to say that once we get better identity in the blockchain, we can get as close to perfection in terms of eliminating fraud as possible. I think, provably fair is an interesting concept. Also, privacy with your votes, because, okay, let's put it this way. Using cryptography, right, and in a public blockchain for an election, you can essentially prove mathematically, right, that candidate A won with 1,000 votes to candidate B who had 950 votes. You can prove that 100% true without revealing the identity of who voted for who, which I think is important as well, because, in certain countries, and you may not want that information getting out there.
It's everywhere.
For sure. And sorry, I just heard this from your wife. She let me know that you voted in Bart Simpson for the last 4 elections. And, for some people, that might be kind of embarrassing, right? Not for you. I think that's cool.
I think I gave it away with my Ay Caramba yard signs. Yeah.
Dude, he's got a good chance in 2020, so keep voting for him.
He can't do any worse than... Anyway, sorry.
Can't do worse than Trump.
I'm doing the old man thing. I got my pants over my belly button. I'm going to turn this car around. Start writing letters to my television station. So, yeah, getting these elections as a base, as being legitimate, I don't think should be too controversial, but you have a very good point there in re-emphasizing that blockchain is not a panacea, because all you need is someone to just believe in it too much, right? And then those points of fragility, those frictionless points, someone exploits, right? And they reconfigure identification, whatever, and people just trust it too much. So very, very good points. But I think for me, the major takeaway, besides having, I think we should once again talk about, and you should reemphasize, having a voting booth in your phone or in your pocket. Besides that, just that it's open, that it's out in sort of the open source cypherpunk ethos, crypto anarchist ethos, where everything's in the light of day, I think will definitely help more people see what's going on in terms of the election, or elections rather, and how they shake out.
For sure, for sure. So listeners, to finish off this episode, I think it was short and sweet. Pretty happy with it. Many people cannot afford usually from lower socioeconomic classes, to go and vote. The time and money it takes to register. Really busy people are not people that say on Facebook that they're busy and then they go to yoga or co-ed softball. They don't have time to complain that they're busy on social media. So it isn't fair to someone who's working a job that they need, they really need money, to have to take time off to go and vote. I just don't think that's fair. I love the idea of being able to do it from your cell phone in a fraction of the time. Just for efficiency purposes.
And also the idea of national referendums. That's something that the United States has yet to implement, and I think would be, especially for the world's largest economy, superpower, modern empire, would be a very, very, very revealing procedure in terms of future policy. It could be something as banal as tax policy, or whether or not to invade a given country.
Yeah, for sure. Big decisions. Changing that culture. I think that's the other thing. That's a great point. But yeah, we'll see. It's only 2 years away, but maybe, Kelso, you'll have the opportunity to choose between Donald Trump, Kanye West, and Bart Simpson, all from your phone. November 2020.
There it is. And just to leave you on a slightly less humorous note here, go back to 2000 and think about the implications of that election. Gore does win the popular vote after everything is shaken out. I think maybe 500,000, something like that. Over.
For those that don't know, who was the governor of the state in question? Jeb Bush, none other than George Bush's brother. Little detail there.
Right. Who got stomped by El Donald, by the way, on this last election. But it's worth listening to the rest of that clip. I don't know if I can convince Matt and Isabel, our producer, to play the last minute and a half or so. It's kind of a long clip, but man, it's fun to listen to them going back and forth. But if they do, and even if they don't, keep this in your mind. So Bush is pronounced Führer of the United States and takes his reign, and 9 months later, the entire world changes. It just changes with the attacks on the World Trade Centers and so forth. That's what's at stake.
Yeah, that's what's at stake, man. All right, well, Isa, why don't you go ahead and play that clip after the outro for those that are still listening. And fun episode, Kelso, and I'll see you next week, buddy.
Yeah, man. See ya!
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit Bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column. 25 very big electoral votes in the home state of the governor's brother, Jeb Bush, are hanging the balance. This no longer is a victory for Vice President Gore. George Bush, governor of Texas, will become the 43rd president of the United States at 18 minutes past 2 o'clock Eastern Time. CNN declares that George Walker Bush has won Florida's 25 electoral votes.
The vice president has recalled the governor and retracted his concession.
But this race is simply too close to call. And until the recount is concluded and the results of Florida become official, our campaign continues.
Bill Daley, the chairman of the Gore campaign, you just heard it. We're all, I think we can hardly believe our ears. He said, until the results are official and certified in the state of Florida, we are going to continue our campaign.
We hope and believe we have elected the next president of the United States. They're still counting, and I'm confident when it's all said and done, we will prevail.
For every successive hour from this point on, CNN will be your network to find out what is the latest on that presidential race.
That's right.
In the United States.
So stay with CNN because whatever is happening, we are going to be bringing it to you.
And folks, in the year 2004, please, could you make up your minds a little more conclusively? Because I think we can't take another election like this one.